So in today's video, I'm going to show you how to paint simple tropical birds in Procreate. After that, we'll paint a bunch of birds, print them out, and create this collage shadow box. As usual, you can follow this video with any brushes, but I'll list the ones I'm using in the description. So the technique I'm using here has just 6 steps, and I'll show you really quickly what that looks like. Step 1, find a reference photo of a real bird and use it to make a rough sketch. Step 2, lay down a light background wash and then fill out all the main colors and shapes of the different parts of the bird. I'm going way outside the sketch in most of this, but I'm trying to ignore that for now because I think it's easier to cut everything back later on all at the same time. If you want to kind of erase it as you go and stay within the sketch, that's also totally fine. Step 3, merge everything together onto one layer and then use the eraser to cut everything back so it matches the sketch. Step 4, use the fine liner pen to paint the eyes and the feet. You can also add some very light outlines if the bird needs it. Step 5, use the selection tool to add a few highlights and shadows. And finally, step 6, it's optional, but you can add a slight skew to give the bird a little perspective. So that's pretty much the whole process, and it works particularly well for colorful birds. If the bird only has a few colors like this one, you'll have to lean more heavily on outlines, but I think it still works great. And with all that said, you can go through the process again a little bit slower and step by step using this bee eater as a reference. So the first thing we need to do is create a very rough sketch. Since I'm going for kind of a geometric style, I'll do my best to translate the bird into just a few simple shapes. Once that's finished, I'll make a layer above the rough sketch and use it to trace out a super clean version of it. After that, I'm going to move the layer it's on kind of above everything, up there with the reference. I'll set the transparency mode of the sketch to multiply, and then I'll lower it so I can barely see it. And then of course to start painting, I'm going to select a blank layer down here below everything. And the first thing I'm going to do is create a sort of average background wash. Now usually for birds, this is going to be a yellow tone or a slightly purple tone. I think for this one it's kind of a yellow, so I'll try to find that color. For the brush, I'm going to use the abstract round, and I'll do a very rough overall wash that goes beyond the sketch. I'm not worried about that for now because we can cut it back later. After that, I'm going to go through and start filling in all the different colors of the different parts of the bird. Usually I start with the body, and I recommend adding those kind of on separate layers of their own. And I think this body is mostly a kind of greenish tone, so I'll fill it out like this. Once again, I'm not worried about going beyond the edges of my sketch. Now to create this kind of ombre effect, you can kind of judge, again, there's no right answers, but the front of it here is more yellow, the base of it is more black, so I'll try to approximate that. I think that's pretty good. After that, I'm going to grab the water blender, and I'm going to use it to smooth all this out. I think the back of the neck has a little bit of red in there, so I'll try to add that in. And once the main body color is filled in, I recommend doing the wings next. And sometimes, especially in this case, you can see a little bit of black is going into the wing area. So I recommend just clearing out the wing area with the eraser brush. So I'm going to set that to the fine liner pen. And I'm just going to use that to erase through the body layer here and clean out this space. And now moving on to the wing, I'll make another blank layer. I'll choose a good color for that based on the reference photo. And once again, I'm going to use the abstract round. But in the case of the wing, usually the feathers on the wing are larger. So I'm going to choose an intentionally lighter version of the wing color, and I'll fill it out like this. Then after that, I'll choose a slightly darker color, a smaller brush size, and I'm going to do these very rough overlapping strokes that sort of mimic the larger feathers. And once the wing is roughly filled in like this, I'm going to grab the eraser again and use it to cut it back so it matches the sketch. Now for this wing in particular, it has 2 different colors in it. It kind of goes from green to blue. You could go ahead and paint on blue on the ends there, but I think I'm just going to use the selection tool and then shift the hue. So for that, I'll grab the freehand selection tool. I'll just select the ends of the wings, hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll adjust this until I can get the right blue tone. Now to save time, I'm going to fast forward through this, but I'm basically just continuing with the same process, creating a blank layer, filling out the rough colors of the elements, cutting it back, and blending it as I need to. And you can see here, it's a little bit confusing because the beak is black and also there's these black feathers kind of on the side of the head. So I want to find a way to differentiate those, and I think I can do that by adding some shading and a highlight. So these are all on one layer here, and I've got that layer selected. I'm just going to use the freehand selection tool again and just kind of isolate the beak. I'll brighten it a little bit. And then I think I'll do another selection just along the middle of the beak and then on the nose area, and I'll brighten that as well, just to give this a little bit more contrast. So at this point, I've got all the major colors of the different feathers and elements of the bird laid down. I've ignored the eye and the feet because I'll add those as details later on. At this point, I need to refine the overall shape. So for that, I'm going to merge everything so far onto one layer. Then I'm going to use the eraser brush, set to the fine liner pen, and I've really cranked up the streamline, like almost 50%, and I'm going to use that to erase everything back so it perfectly matches the sketch. Now for the tail area, it's difficult to erase it back to the sketch because I can't see it clearly. So in this case, what I usually do is I'll just lighten the opacity of the whole bird, just temporarily. Then I can see my lines, and I know where to erase. And at this point, we can finally move on and start adding some details. And those are going to be on their own separate layer, just above the bird. For the brush, I'm going to do them all with the fine liner pen. And fortunately for birds, the details are really simple. Usually the eye is just basically a black eye with some kind of colored ring. And birds' feet can be tricky if you overthink it, but I'm totally fine with doing them really simplistically like this. Another detail I like to add are some very sparing outlines, and for those, I recommend making those on another blank layer. I pretty much always do them in pure white, and since I like my outlines to be kind of scratchy, I'm going to go to the drawing tab and use the little pine brush. And I'm just going to use this to kind of suggest a few feathers. And since these lines look a little bit too bold, I'm going to lower the opacity of that layer, just so I can barely see them. And once I'm happy with how everything looks, I'll merge it all together onto one layer. And with the details finished, the bird usually looks pretty good, but maybe it's a tiny bit too flat. So at this point, I like to add some shading. And I do pretty much all this with the selection tool set to freehand. So for example, I want to shade the head here a little bit. So I'll select that area. I'll feather it out, and then I'll brighten it a little bit. And I'm going to go over the whole bird and add maybe 2 or 3 very soft shadows and highlights using the same method. And sometimes when I add the shadows, I do shift the hue a little bit towards a warmer or colder color. And at this point, the bird looks really good. This is definitely a very simple illustration style, so the last step I recommend doing is adding a little bit of a skew to it to make it look more interesting. So for that, I'm going to turn off the reference photo, and I'm going to make sure my bird layer is selected. Then I can use the arrow tool, set to distort, and I'm going to rotate and twist this thing, pull some of these nodes, and what this skewing trick is basically doing is it's kind of aligning all the small details to point sort of in one direction, and it's a very subconscious effect, but you do notice it, and it gives the bird a little bit of momentum and perspective. So at this point, the bee eater is finished, and here's what it looks like. I've gone ahead and used this same process to paint 8 more birds, and my plan here is to basically create a sort of framed collage with all the birds together. Unfortunately, my printer isn't able to print on such a large paper, so I had to come up with a workaround. So what I ended up doing was I just printed out each bird just by itself on regular satin 4x6 photo paper. The black bird was a little bit too big, so I split them onto 2 different papers, but all the other birds fit just fine. After that, I went through and cut out each bird, but I made sure to leave a little bit of white on the edges. I thought this would take a long time, but surprisingly it only took like 15 minutes to cut out all 9 birds. And of course, after that, once they're all cut out, I just arranged them into the shadow box and mounted them with foam tape. And here's the final result. I'm super impressed with how well the birds look when they're arranged together like this. During the process of painting 9 separate birds, I definitely had some birds that I liked more than others, and especially the tiny green bird. I really didn't like him. But seeing them all together like this and how they all support each other in the overall design, I don't think I would change a thing. And all that's basically just to say, when you're painting a bunch of birds, it's not reasonable to expect every bird to be your favorite. You're gonna paint a few that you don't like, but I promise when you arrange them all together like this, you'll be super happy with the result. And that pretty much wraps it up. If you think I've earned it, please give this video a like. And if you're looking for more interesting Procreate painting projects like this, check out one of these videos next.